Hi, this is Mike Fauché. If you followed my other videos, you kind of already have the thing configured now, and you have it installed, and you're now ready to do the next phase of the configuration. So, although 2 ports is the minimum requirement, I'm going to suggest to you that you consider at least 3 to 4 ports. You can either do a dual NIC and use the internal NIC as a third port, or what I recommend, and there's a reason for my recommendation, is to basically disable the internal port and use a quad NIC in your firewall. So, but again, the punchline is that minimum is 2. I'm going to walk through this with my particular recommendations, and then you can kind of draw your own assessment from there. So, to get started, I want to talk about how I'm going to approach this, because I approach it differently than maybe somebody else will. And there's really no right or wrong way. There's just whatever you're comfortable with. So let's get started quickly with the network section, which is where the port really begins. And that's kind of where I start. And as you can see here, there's basically 4 ports, which is the 4 NICs that I have in my system, plus a default guest AP, which isn't connected to anything. Now, I start with this because I like to configure the basics of my network first. So port 1 is going to be reserved for your LAN. You can change the IP range and all that stuff, but we're not going to do that right now. Port 2 is dhcp, so it's going to take whatever modem you have plugged in. So as soon as you plug in your cable modem or whatever it is you're using, it's going to detect that IP address, and that should kind of self-manage. So I'm going to pick it up from on the assumption that you have more than 2 NICs and that you want to do a custom configuration, and kind of show you how that works, how that ties into dhcp and so on. So I'm going to start with port number 3. Right now it's disabled, it's not configured, it's not anything. So if I go into port 3, I have some options. Across the top I have interface, zones, DNS, DHCP, which we'll get into a little bit later, and we only need a couple of these tabs, but there's what we use in the home is probably considerably different than what's being used in the enterprise, so you have a lot more flexibility even though you don't need it. So port number 3 right now is not on any zone, but what I'd like to do is to put it on the LAN. And again, you can have multiple ports on the LAN. Out of the box, Sophos does not allow any inter-zone communication. So it doesn't let one zone talk to the other zone, or one port talk to the other zone. So whatever I put on the LAN is not going to go and be able to talk to the Wi-Fi network or even the WAN network until I allow it to. So I'm going to go ahead and select LAN, and then basically I'm going to assign a static IP for this particular port. So I'm just going to make something up for now, and I'm just going to call it 10.0.0.1. And that's just what I want to call it. I'm going to leave it as a /24, and really all I need to configure there. So all I've really done here to configure this, and I don't need the rest of this, so we're not even going to go over it. All I've really done is say port 3 is a LAN port. It's an IP4 configuration. It has a static address of 10.0.0.1. That's all I've done. So, and I got one too many periods in here, so let's get rid of that. So I'm basically done with that. I'm going to go ahead and save the configuration. It's telling me, yeah, it's going to update, so we'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so now we can see down here in the port listing that I have now port 3 enabled. This is the IP address, and it can be accessed. That becomes basically the default gateway for that network. So it haven't done anything else with it yet. So the next step, at least in the way I do things, is to now assign DHCP. Now DHCP is assigned to port 1 by default. So let's go over to DHCP, and you can see that by default, when you set it up, it already assigns DHCP and already assigns a static range. And again, if you're just plugging into a 2-port configuration and you just want to get it running, as soon as you plug into port 1, you're on your way. The DHCP's already been set up for you. We'll get into static IPs here in just a minute. So, but what I want to do here, though, is add another DHCP, and I want to add it for port 3. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to hit add, and I'm just going to say, I'll just make up something and call it secondary network, only for lack of better things to call it. And I'm going to select the interface, which is port 3, and that's the one I just created. And I'm going to give it a starting range. So I'm going to say 10.0.0. I'll just say 100 for now. And the end IP I have is 10.0.0.254. So there's my static range. Now, what I can do, and I don't want to get into that too much right now, is I could actually break this up. This little plus sign here allows me to create multiple ranges. So I could have a range from 100 to 150, 150 to 200, so on. And there's a reason that I might want to do that, but it's more of the naming and more of the advanced configurations when you get into the firewall. For now, let's just leave it at that. So I'm just going to hit tab, and I'm just going to hit save. So I now have DHCP by default on port 1. I'm not going to worry about this guest access because that's, again, out of the box default, which I'm not using. And then the secondary network, which we just created on port 3. And they're all live. So if I plug into something in port 3, I'm going to get something between a 10.0.0.100 and a 254 address. And it'll serve up DHCP addresses. So from there, if I have the 4th port, and I want to create something else, I go and step and repeat the same process I did for port 3. So it allows me to create as many networks or subnetworks as I want, so that I can create custom configurations, isolation, other things I might want to do later on. And we'll get into that more as we get into the firewall rules. So one last thing I want to cover in this particular section, that's the static IPs, because that's also plays a critical role in the next section when we get into naming your assets, your devices. So let's just go into the secondary network that we just created, and you see the range that we created here for the dynamic or the DHCP address, which is the 100 to 254 here. What I want to also do is to create a device static IP. So, and this is probably one of my only complaints about Sophos, is creating static IPs is not nearly as easy as it should be. And it's not that it's hard, it's kind of cumbersome. And you'll see why in a second. So let's assume for a moment that I want to assign a static IP. The first thing I need to know is I need to realize that my static IPs need to be lower than my DHCP range. So I'm going to be able to assign a static IP from .2 to .99. Anything above that's going to be picked up by the DHCP. So here I can put a device name. I'll just call it server, for lack of a better term. And then here I'm going to type the MAC IP address. Okay, so it helps when you know how to type. So now I've created, if I go back and take a look at this, what I've created is my first static IP address. And again, I'm going to have to go through and create all of the static IPs I want, and basically list all of the devices that I want to put static IPs on. Again, it's a little cumbersome, but one trick I might recommend is go ahead and plug your devices in. Go ahead and let the DHCP server pick it up, and then through a separate window, go ahead and copy the MAC addresses in, one by one. It'll save you from having to type that all in independently. So it's relatively quick if you do it that way to go ahead and type them in. Or you could type them into, a Word or Excel document, whatever you want. But if you have, if you're able to copy and paste, it's a lot quicker, and you can go through and build your whole static IP. And it'll make more sense why we want to make static IPs, a little bit later when you get into the actual, firewall filtering, blocking, etc. Now that I've created my static IP, I've pretty well configured my network. My last and final step for the configuration will be the naming caveat, and so we'll spend a little bit of time to go through that right away so you can get an idea of how this all ties together. And this may sound a little bit cumbersome. It's really not that bad, and it'll all make sense when you tie it all together into a firewall rule. And what you'll find also is that by using naming conventions for devices, it offers you kind of some help in maintenance. Specifically, what I mean is if I use a name in a firewall rule, it allows me to even alter the IP addresses or make changes to that device and basically make one edit in one place and have it, be applicable to everywhere that device is used in any firewall rule. So it'll make more sense as we start to build the rule. So hopefully this makes a little bit of sense so far. So what we've done is basically configure the network, configure our DHCP, configure our static IP addresses, and now we're going to go into naming, which is down under host and services. And under host and services, what we have here is some default stuff that comes out of the box. They kind of give you the different ports. They give you some default names, and from there on, you're kind of on your own to build devices. So what we're going to do here is add a name. So we're adding a name, and I'm going to call it server because that's what I called it on the other one. And I can call it, they don't have to match. I can call this anything I want. As long as I know what device I'm going to pull into my firewall rule later. So I'm going to leave it everything default. It's an IP address, and I'll show you the difference here between the types. But right now, we'll call it a server. It's going to be an IPv4 address, and I'm going to type the address, and that address was 10.0.0.2. And I'm going to save that. Okay, so I've created a name down here. It's called server. I'm going to use that name server in my firewall rule later on. And as you'll see, when I create the firewall rule and I call out this particular name, I'll never have to change that name in the firewall rule. And even if I change IPs or change configuration, all I have to do is go edit the particular name, change the IP address, and I've now reconfigured wherever that device is used in every firewall. Now, one more thing I want to cover on naming, and then we'll kind of call this video done and move on to actually configuring web rules and filters and so on. So one other option I have besides naming devices, and again, I want to probably name as many devices as you possibly can right out of the gate. I can also, if I want to, name a range. So let's say, for example, I'm going to call it, I'm just going to say up here, I'm going to call this secondary network. And I'm going to say it's not an IP, but it's rather an IP range. I'm going to name the entire range. So I'm going to say 10.0.0.1 to 10.0.0.254, and that's all I'm going to say. So basically what I've done here is I've named my entire network secondary network, which allows me to basically create rules for that entire network. So I can create default rules, I can create network-to-network rules, I can do whatever I want in its entirety by this particular range. And then, of course, the individual devices, I can also create additional rules. For example, you might have a particular device that belongs to a family member that's on a static IP that you don't want that device to go anywhere, or you want it to have special filtering rules, then you'll be able to do that with this configuration. So again, as a recap, all I've done is name things, and I can name things any way I want. But I've named a device, and I've named an entire network. So, and as we tie this together in the firewall rules in the next part of the video, it will make a little bit more sense. So the last part we want to cover here is actually tying all this together. So we did the configuration, we did the network cards, we did the naming, we did the DHCP. We've kind of set up the whole foundation of how we're going to tie all this together. So now there's just a couple things left to do. And hopefully by the time we finish this, it'll kind of make sense, and you'll better understand why this is actually a fairly straightforward approach to firewalls, and it's extremely powerful, which allows you just a ton of different configuration options, especially when you get into filtering and things like that. So I want to talk briefly about rules. So if we click on Firewall, when you created this, or when you installed it, it kind of created a couple of default rules for you. So we're going to get into these a little bit. First of all, what I've been typically doing on these is I actually delete the first rule or turn them both off and actually create my own, because I'm not using the default ports, because I'm not using port 1 at all for other than configuration. The rules really don't do anything for me, so I kind of want to start from scratch. But before we get into that, I kind of want to talk a little bit about some of the how these are laid out. The first thing you need to know about rules is that they operate from top to bottom. So when you create a block rule and you put it underneath an allow rule, the allow rule is going to take precedence. So most of the time it's not all that important, but it is important if you're trying to do two different things with the same within the same groupings. For example, you might want to certain IPs. You might have a default rule of your network, for example, that allows you to go to anywhere you want to go, and then you want to block a specific group of IPs or a specific network, maybe one that's on port 4 or something, and you want to block that. You need to make sure that block is above the allow all rule. So rules go in order of priority. There are also two types of rules. If I click on, there's an add firewall rule, there's two options: user network rule, which is probably what I'll use most of the time. That's what controls filtering, application filtering, web filtering, blocking, access, things like that. And then there's the business application rule, which is only important for most of us in the home use for port forwarding. So if I want to take if I want to forward something that's coming in off my WAN port over to like a plex server or something like that, then I'm going to use the business application rule. And we'll go through examples of each of these so you kind of know how they're built. They're very, very simple to build, but especially given the foundation and the work that we just did. So I also want to kind of cover the navigation, because that's changed drastically in version 17. So I've got the triple dots over here on the side, and if I hover over those or if I click on it, it's going to give me some options. First of all, I can turn the rule on and off. I can clone the rule, because if I'm going to do, let's say, 4 or 5 port forwards, I don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. So I can clone the rule and just make the edits. I can edit the actual rule itself, and I can also group them. And we'll get into grouping a little bit later after we've built a couple of default rules. So just for argument's sake, and just to kind of get us started, I want to just do a quick edit on this rule so you can kind of see how it's constructed. Actually, let's go to the other one. Okay, so this is the default rule that basically allows all the devices on the LAN to communicate to the WAN or to your external internet. So let's break this down. So we can kind of understand a little bit how the rule is constructed, and then we're going to sidetrack a little bit and talk about filters, and then we're going to go build a rule for specifically for our network. The premise of the rule is to really tell you that it's asking you what you want to do from a particular location, specifically the source, and to a location. So I'm making a rule that says from this device or devices, allow it to do this or block it or don't allow it to do certain things. So in this particular rule, this basically saying that from the LAN, which is anything that's been labeled LAN on the interfaces, and let's just quickly go back over that just so because I don't know that I covered it very well. Anything that's labeled here as LAN, which would be these two, port 1 and port 3. Port 3 is the one we custom configured. Those are LANs. So basically this is telling me that anything on the LAN you're going to allow to go to the internet. So let's go back to the rule real quick and look at that. Go back and edit that rule. So any zone, which is the LAN, which is if you hover over it, it'll tell you port 1 and port 3. So it's saying anything on the LAN from any network or device, because we're not naming any right now, at all the time is allowed to go to the WAN on any network, any services. And we'll get into services possibly a little bit later. But for 99.9% of the applications, you don't really care about services. The only time services come into play is if you want to limit, FTP and other services like that, VoIP and so on. But for the general application rules, it's not necessary. That's sort of how the rule is constructed. Going further down, you'll see that it has the scan HTTP option. It has option to detect zero-day threats, but again, that's a subscription service, so you'll be seeing it during evaluations, but it'll disappear in the long run. And then the user application filters, any traffic shaping, web policy, and also basically any intrusion protection or prevention, any traffic shaping, web policies, and application control policies will be called out here. And we'll get into those a little bit later, which is why I'm just going over through the overview right now. When we actually construct the rule, these particular topics will make perfect sense because we'll have defined them ourselves. So the rest of this is basically going to stay as is. So I'm going to leave this alone for now. Again, it's just know that this particular rule allows traffic from any device on the LAN to the internet without any any blocks or obstruction other than the rules that have been defined, which we'll get into more later. So I hope that makes sense. So now we're going to deviate a little bit because in order to create our first rule, there's a couple things that we should do. We don't have to, and I'll explain that. But again, I'm approaching this from how I would do it. So what I want to draw let me go back and open this rule. What I want to draw your attention to is there's a couple things that are probably critical to all of us, which is probably why we would even consider running something like this other than something like that you buy off the shelf and plug in. And that power lies in here, in both the intrusion prevention and specifically the web and application policies. Because we're going to define those, that's usually where I start. Yes, I can use the defaults. I can leave them blank. I can do all those things. But I would prefer, when I construct my rules, to use and understand what's in these policies. So I'm not going to define my own intrusion protection because those are pretty well defined and I just use the ones out of the box. But I am, however, going to define my own web policy and application control. Web rules. So I'm going to go over here to web, and this is actually a little bit, it's not all that intuitive, but once you understand how the layout is, you'll find that it's pretty straightforward. So if you noticed in the rule that we just opened up, there was a default policy in place, and that's this default policy. So basically, the default policy, as it's assigned to that default rule, basically blocks a group of URLs, and that's from a group, and we can get into that a little bit later. And then it categoric blocks. It blocks risky downloads, suspicious, nudity, adult content, etc. So what I could do is selectively turn these on that I want to use and leave the rest alone. I can add to this particular default policy, or I can create my own policy so that I know completely what's in it. Now I'm going to choose, and again, you can look at these defaults and pick which something that resembles close to what you want to do. But without knowing what's available, it's kind of difficult to make that judgment. So what I prefer to do is to actually create my own. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new rule. And I'm going to say, I'm going to add a policy. And I'm going to call it something very creative. And let me scroll this down so we can see it. And I'm going to say add a rule. So from this add a rule, I'm going to be able to add these specific categories that I want to add. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add actual categories. So let's take a look at adding a category. So I'm going to hit plus. I'm going to say add to below rule, because this rule's off anyway and it doesn't do anything for me. So I'm just going to say add below. And what I see here is a new rule that applies to anybody. I want to do something other than all traffic. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to leave it to anybody because for the most part we don't define users, or we haven't defined users, and so that means we want it to apply to anything and everything on the network. So I'm going to make this rule, and instead of all traffic, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say add new item. So I'm going to go ahead and click new item. I want to stay away from content filters for now because that's actually a feature we probably won't have access to at this point. But as you can see, by default, it's all traffic. But we don't want that, because what we want to do is block certain things, certain categories. So what we're going to do is go over here to the triple dots and say view all. And then we're going to take and make this web filter say what we want to say. So I can do this a bunch of different ways. Now I'm going to show you probably a short way, a long way, but it'll make some sense. So what I could do now is, for this particular rule, is I can just pick a category at a time. So I can say I want bandwidth heavy. I want, scroll down here, I'm going to pick criminal activities. And these are things I'm going to block, just so we're all clear. I want to block, I don't want anybody financing anything, so I'm going to block that. And I'm going to block games and communication or communities. And then I'm going to block online shopping under nudity and content. And then what I'm going to do is scroll down here and look at categories. So I want to block alcohol and tobacco, anonymizers, auctions, and I'm going to apply 8. So what it's done here, just so we can see what it's done, is it's created in this default web filter, it's created all the things that I'm going to block, because it says action block, right? And it's going to block all of these categories. That's the one way I can do it. So I can list them, put them all in groups. The downside when I do this is that it puts everything in a group. So it's easier to just go down the line and click things and group them all together. However, when I disable the rule, I disable all the categories. So another option would be that after I create my first group, maybe as some really basic things, I can then say, give me another rule. I'm going to put it below. And I'm going to repeat that, except instead of, let me scroll up here a little bit. Instead of all traffic, I'm just going to go show all. And I'm going to scroll down to just, I don't want software updates, I don't want spam. So I'm just going to pick those two. And I'm going to click. So I've created those two. So now I'm beginning to build my web filter. And you can see that underneath Mike's web filter, I'm starting to build things that I want to block. And of course, I'm going to turn these on because I want them. I built these. I might as well use them. And the ability to turn things on and off is kind of powerful because it helps you in your troubleshooting if you have any troubleshooting. And again, you can continue to build this for as long as you need to. My suggestion is that you do as little grouping as possible. It's easier, and I'm going to apply these changes and I'll show you kind of what I mean. If I look at the default rule that they created for me, everything is separate. So almost everything is separate. So a lot of these are standalone single categories, so I can selectively turn them on and off. I suggest you do the same thing in your default rule that you create, because it makes it, again, much easier to edit, much easier to control, and it is not all that difficult to add. So if all I have to do is click plus below, assign it an item. So I'm just going to say add new item. And again, I need to scroll up. I'm going to uncheck all traffic, and I'm going to go select the one item that I want, click apply, and I've now created that item. So again, you can kind of get the idea. I'm going to start building my entire rules based on categories, activities, things that are available to me. And if you scroll through the list, you'll see that there's quite a bit. So once I'm done building my rule, again, don't forget to turn them on because they are off by default. And then apply changes. And once you hit apply changes, you'll see your rules, all your categories and your criteria built up under the web policy. So we just created our first web policy. We're going to go through next and talk about applications policy, and then you'll see how powerful that is. And then we're going to put it all together and say, how do I make a rule? So let's go on to applications. So I'm going to click over on applications. And again, the default rule of applications is kind of not useful to me. This isn't really what I want. So what I'm going to actually do here is I'm going to create actually a application filter, which I'm going to apply to the rule. So I'm just going to call it test filter. So again, you'll see better what that means. I'm going to leave it for allow all for now, and I'm just going to hit save. Now, all I've done here is create a rule name. When I go ahead and actually click and edit that rule, I now see there is absolutely no criteria in there. So I'm going to add criteria. So if I hit add, I now have a whole bunch of stuff that I can add here. And I can also search. So let's say I want to block all peer-to-peers. So I can go in here and say, just block me peer-to-peers. And I'm going to click OK. And you'll see that it's pulled up quite a few peer-to-peer networks, 50 in all. And it's basically going to block those. So what I've done here is say, let me go ahead and save this. So what it's done is it's taken and it's right now allowing all of these peer-to-peers. But what I would really want to do is block them. So I'm going to go back and edit that down here, deny, save. And so now you see my first application rule. It's intimidating because it lists every single peer-to-peer known to mankind, but all I really did is pick a category. And it basically says that, at any time, all of these peer-to-peer applications will be blocked. That's all it says. That's all I've done. And I can create multiple segments of this. So I can go ahead and click Add. And this time I can pick a different category. Let's say maybe file transfer, and maybe let's pick how about remote access, proxy, and tunneling. So I'm going to click OK, and what it's going to do is pick all these 130 in total. I'm going to deny them, and I'm going to hit save. So again, I've added another segment to my application list. And I would suggest you look at these closely, and I will show you a way that you can actually individually select these. So if I decided I've blocked too many things, because one of the things that you block, for example, in this remote control selection is I might block remote desktop. So you can go in and edit the list that it selects, because what you've got here is you've got 130 items. I can scroll through this list and deselect the ones that I don't want. And that you can do by saying select individual application. So what I've done here is basically switched from select all by category to I found the category I want, but now I'm going to go and selectively pick the ones I want. I can also do this and select them all and basically go down and say, let me go find the one I really wanted to allow. I'm just going to make one up and uncheck that one. I hit save, and I'm on my way. So a tremendous amount of power and flexibility to control things you don't want people to do on your network. Again, if you've got kids and other family members that maybe don't value the security, this is a great way to really tie things down. And you can add to it. So you can start low and just keep adding to it if you want. Or you can start at the extreme level and start backing things off. Another way to select an application category would be, and by the time we're done with this, probably nothing will work, but if I want to, I can, let's add one more. And I'm just showing you different examples. I can also select by risk level. So I might say, just give me the stuff that's rated very high. I don't care what it is. I don't care what category it is. Just pick the stuff that's rated high. And you'll see things from VPNs, peer-to-peer, or whatever. So if I just did that as my entry rule, maybe pick the top 2 categories, I would end up with quite a few selections, 169 from this category and probably more if I select 4 and 5. And again, it allows me to build up my rule. So the punchline is I've created this massive application rule that I can assign to my firewall rule. Okay, so let's move on. I'm going to save this for now. So again, we've got an application filter that we've called test filter. To recap, we've got a web filter that we've called mics. Down here, a little further down, there it is. And so we've created the 2 basic things that we need, 2 of the 3 basic things that we need to create our firewall rule. So we're now ready to create the firewall rule. So let's go do that. And let's start with, we're going to go ahead and just turn these off for now. So I'm going to turn these off. Yes. I'm going to turn this off and say yes. Okay, so now with these off, nothing will communicate, nowhere. So now what I want to do is say, okay, I want to add a firewall rule. I want a user network rule. So I'm just going to call this test. I can optionally enter a description. And the position, again, I'm going to put this at the bottom, but since this is the only rule that's active, it doesn't matter. And the rule is going to be for accepting. I have an option to create a rule to drop or to reject. But right now what we're trying to do is to create a rule that allows all traffic to get to my internet, but passing through the filters and stuff that I want to pass through. So my first decision is what zone. So I'm going to add the LAN zone and say OK. And because I want this rule to only apply to my secondary network, I'm going to limit it to that. So I'm going to say add item. I'm going to uncheck any. And I'm going to go down to where I've put secondary network. And again, because I name these, I can control them independently. So I'm going to hit secondary network, apply. So just to briefly, let's talk about what we just did. We picked a zone, a LAN zone. We picked specifically out of that LAN zone, we picked a secondary network. And if you recall, that was port number 3 that we kind of isolated. And so from that LAN, we picked the secondary network. So anything that's in that secondary network will be allowed to communicate to the WAN, and I don't care about destination because all I care is about to get to the WAN. So that's any network, any service. So the next step is, do you want to match users? No, I don't have any users, so I'm not going to match users. I am going to take advantage of the antivirus and go ahead and activate that. And I'm going to now pick the rules I created. So the first thing is intrusion protection. And I'm going to use the defaults for that because that's a little more complicated to set up. I'm going to use the default LAN to WAN. And then for I'm not going to do traffic shaping because I don't need to right now. I am going to pick the web policy, and that web policy is the one that I select, that I created. So let's go to Mike's web policy. So, and then the last item I'm going to pick is application control, and I'm going to pick the test filter. So just to recap, I've got a intrusion protection LAN to WAN. I've got all traffic from port number 3 or the secondary network passing through this intrusion protection, this Mike's web policy that we just created, and the application control policy that we just created. The rest of this I can't use. The rest of this I'm going to leave at default. I can optionally choose to log traffic or not, so I'm going to go ahead and say yes, and I'm going to hit save. And I now have my first firewall rule. This will allow all LAN traffic on the secondary network to get to the WAN using any service, and it's going to log, as you can see here. It's got AV applied to it. It's got a NAP policy. It's got IPS, intrusion protection. So I'm done. I've got traffic going through my firewall rule, and I can now begin to, funnel traffic through these filters. And again, I can tweak these filters. I can change them. I don't have to go back and change anything in the firewall rule. I just change the filters themselves. Now, one last rule, and then we'll pretty much have everything under control. Okay, let's get into the last part of creating rules. This is probably going to be the little bit trickier one because we're dealing with port forwarding. Port forwarding is something that's really not been super straightforward in Sophos, and this new version they've actually made it a little bit less obvious. Once you kind of master it though and understand that some of the defaults, it's pretty easy and you can really go to town. So Let's get started and create our first port forwarding rule. So we're going to use the business application rule for this. And the very first thing we want to do is select a template. Now there's a bunch of stuff listed here, none of which we really care about except this DNAT template, and that's the one you're going to use all the time for port forwarding. None of the other stuff you're ever going to use at home there. So let's go ahead and select that one. And it pulls up our template. So the first thing we're going to do is give it a name. So we'll call it test 12. And we'll give it a description. Let's clean that up a little bit here. Okay, so then the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to select the source. Now the source is where the packets or where the call is coming from, and that's really coming from our WAN. So let's go ahead and select WAN, hit apply. And under available client networks, we're going to basically use any in all cases here. So we're just going to put any. Okay, and now we're going to get into the destination. This is where it gets a little trickier. So in the destination, we're actually going to select a network. So that's going to be the network that we'd like it to go to. And in this particular one, we're going to actually pick port 3 because we really want this to go into the port 3. So let's pick port 3. And this is where it gets a little tricky because they now want us to use a port forwarding service, which is really, it's kind of confusing. I'm not sure I could probably explain it as well as it needs to be explained. But suffice it to know that the protocol or the format that we're going to use here is the same all the time. And I've spoken to them about this. It does work. I'm just not sure that I could give it justice by trying to explain it, so I'm not going to even attempt it. So under services, the first thing we're going to want to do is, since we're doing a plex simulation here, is we're going to want to create a plex service. I should have said create new first. Under services, and I'm going to call it plex test. And this is where we're going to select something that we haven't had to select before. And this is where we actually are, you're going to put in a value that's going to be the same all the time, and it's really looking for a range. And I'll try and explain how this actually works. Because when you're forwarding to a specific computer or a specific network, it wants to know the range of ports that it's actually going to basically monitor. So in here, there's a default value of it's going to be 1:65535, and it's going to be that value all the time. And basically that it's all the entire range of ports that it's going to monitor for the particular call, for the particular packets it's looking for. Now on a destination port, that's the port that we're actually forwarding. So in this case, since it's plex, I'm going to say 32400, and I'm going to hit save. So when we did this, you can see it's actually pre-filled out a non-editable field where it's put in 32400. I know it sounds confusing, but just have to remember that you have to create a port forwarding service, and it always has to start with that entire range. And now there's other things that we can do there, but that's all we're going to really talk about today. So from here, we're going to pick the protected server, which is the server we've created a long time ago and when we watched the earlier rules, and we're going to catch this from the LAN network. So we've now basically completed the port forwarding rule. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and it's saved. So I know, again, it sounds probably confusing, but this is the entire process to create a port forwarding rule. And then once you've created it, like I said, you can always clone the rule. So Once you've got your format down, if you ever have to do more, you can just clone the rule, change the service, change the server, and you're on your way. So it doesn't have to be super convoluted, but it does have to be set up in this particular configuration. So just a recap, I'm going to reopen this and just edit the rule just to make sure that you're clear. So what we have is a rule name. The source is the WAN, because we're trying to monitor or port forward something coming in from the internet on any client or network. We're not filtering that at all at this time. So from there, our destination is to forward it to our port 3 network, which could be something else. It could be port 1 for you, it could be port 4, it could be wherever you want to go, wherever this device is, the computer that we're forwarding to. So in this case, since we've been using this custom port all along, I'm forwarding it to port 3. And again, this new service has been created with the range of, let me just go ahead and pull it open, with the range of 1:65535, and the destination port is the port that I'm actually forwarding. So this is the only thing that will ever change in any of your rules. The rest will be created exactly the same. And I'm forwarding it to a LAN on the LAN zone. And that's all. That's all there is. Again, if you get these basic defaults down, you can create lots of port forwarding rules and do what you need to do. Port forwarding is always an issue anyway. You want to minimize that whenever you can, but this is the process for doing it. So whether you've got your, in my case, I've got only a couple of port forwards, and that's basically for my security cameras and plex. The rest I don't port forward anymore. So I hope that makes sense. That's basically the two types of rules, from our network and network filtering rules to a port forwarding rules. And again, there's a lot of variations in between both of those, but this should really cover both of the basics, and then you can kind of build it upon yourself. So I hope that makes sense. So from there, you're basically ready to run. Once you start building a few of these rules, you'll find that it's pretty easy. That's pretty much all I'm going to cover from this series. There's a few other things I can do from a navigational point of view, but I'm save that for some other time. Basically, this gets you up and running. The one last thing I want to talk about is I want to reemphasize the priority. So your default rule should probably be the last rule. So anything that's specific, for a particular network or device should always be above your default rule. So our default rule or rules should appear at the bottom. The other thing is new in version 7 is you now have the option of grouping. So I may have a bunch of rules here, and rather than having a long screen showing all the separate rules, I can actually create a new group, and it will group much like you see on your smartphone, where you can layer different applications into a specific group. This runs the same way. I can show you real quick. If I do a new group, I'll say new group, and I'll just call it test for now. Don't really need a description. So I'm going to move it. There's my test group. The rule says I have one rule in it, and you can see underneath, if I blow down, there's my test rule. And I can also take and move any of these other rules in there. So if I want to take this one, I can actually move this. Let me scroll up a little bit. Move this to the test group, and I'll say OK. And you'll see now that my screen is getting shorter, and I now have two rules underneath my test group. So what this does is allows you to clean up and sanitize your interface and group all of the similar type rules. So for example, let's say you have 3 or 4 port forwarding rules, rather than leave them listed individually, which in the beginning is sort of easier to see. But at the end of the day, when you're comfortable with it, it's nice to group all that together. So I can create a port forwarding group and move all of my port forwardings there, or I can I can create, let's say, a separate set of rules for one network and a separate set of rules for or filters for the guest network, and I can group those together to make it a little bit easier to manage. So when I'm looking for specifically something that I want to change, I know kind of exactly where to go. Anyway, I hope this was helpful. I really think it's worth your while to test it out and try it. It's an extremely powerful tool. Don't get intimidated by all the options, because all you really are going to ever do, or mostly do, is setting up your initial network, which is your basically your interface cards and your DHCP. You're going to from that point on, you're going to create your filters, and then also your static IPs, and then your web filters, your application filters, and then your ultimately your firewall rules, which is where the power really starts. So the rest of this stuff you probably aren't going to mess with, at least in the beginning. You certainly can browse through it at a later time and see what kind of power is available to you. But for the most part, you're not going to worry too much about it. One last thing I want to cover, and that's under backup and firmware. Make sure you always have that on. That's been configured usually when you set the thing up. And really get those backups, because it's extremely simple to do a restore and to port your configuration over to a different piece of hardware if something goes wrong. So you always want to keep that backup handy. Anyway, that concludes the setup and configuration. I'm ready to go surfing, and I hope it was worthwhile for you and you enjoyed it. I will talk to you guys later.